LJN, the Rainbow of Doom. Most people despise the company and their supposedly crappy games, but I actually enjoy them, and that's why I now don the moniker of the LJN Defender! My name is Matt, and this is a very important occasion. Around this time in 2013, I launched the show which defined this channel and gave me the reputation as the idiot who doesn't know what good games are. Yes, as crazy as it is to believe, it's been just about 5 years since I donned the moniker of the LJN Defender, and I've helped bring some much needed positivity to the Rainbow of Doom. I've stood up for a number of those supposedly irredeemable stinkers, but I still have quite a few left on my plate, so in celebration of this monumental milestone, I figured that I'd take care of some of my loose ends in an epic multi-game review. Without further ado, let's kick this shindig off with the most controversial cartridges of all. I'm talking about the ones that have haunted impressionable young gamers since childhood and sent a shiver of cold dread down the spines of even the most ardent of acclaim apologists. Brace yourselves, folks, because here comes the devil in plastic itself, aka Roger Clemens MVP Baseball! After teasing this trilogy during a fake out at the beginning of the Friday the 13th video, the time has finally arrived to take to the field with this 8 and 16-bit MLB tie-in. Released in October 1991 and September 1992, Roger Clemens' MVP Baseball was developed for the NES, Game Boy, and Super Nintendo by Sculptured Software. Sculptured Software had a long and illustrious career in the sports game field during the 80s and 90s, and they brought that expertise into this branded baseball title, albeit in an unconventional manner. In stark contrast to the majority of the sports offerings of the era, and in spite of the Roger Clemens endorsement, MVP Baseball features a roster of fake teams to choose from, including the amusingly named Minnesota Hounds, Chicago Swords, and Montreal Lumberjacks. Regardless of which version you played, the teams and general play options remain the same, with up to 2 players squaring off in exhibition or regular season matches. As a non-sports fan without a co-op buddy, I found very few differences between the versions, and the only thing that appealed to me was the advanced aesthetics on the SNES. Minus the awkward sprite scaling effect, the 16-bit presentation is as close to jaw-dropping as a retro baseball game can get, with a vivid saturated color scheme, fluid animations, and a rocking soundtrack tailor-made for the stadium environment. Atmospheric audio and gorgeous graphics aside, Roger Clemens is a fairly middle-of-the-road baseball game. The lack of legitimate teams may disappoint Diamond diehards, but it enhanced my personal experience, and even though the CPU opponents constantly kicked my ass, I found it to be infinitely better than its officially endorsed predecessor, aka MLB for the NES. The 1988 Atlas-developed entry into the NES library is one of the first cartridges on the console to contain the rainbow logo, and unlike Karate Kid, Jaws, and the rest of the early LJN 8-bit output, it strongly shows its age. The graphics are primitive and the audio is a horrific mess, but the clunky controls are the biggest offender. The pitcher is locked on the plate and devoid of any dynamics, while the outfielders apparently are linked by a hive mind since we can't move one without shifting the position of their peers. As someone who already lacked proficiency in the genre, I found this to be frustrating to the nth degree, and it immediately sucked any fun from what should have been a top-notch product, but luckily for me, Atlas's failure was quickly brushed over by the last of LJN's sports titles, NBA All-Star Challenge. NBA All-Star Challenge for the Super Nintendo and Game Boy brings Beam back to the development chair and does a much better job of recreating the intense court action, with Jordan, Ewing, and the rest of the era heavyweights being front and center. All-Star Challenge further improves upon its Sculptured Software siblings by offering a wider variety of play options, ranging from the 3-point shootout to slam dunk competitions and horse. With the exception of the free throw mode, which I found to be cumbersome and clunky, all of the play options were accessible and had something to offer for even non-NBA fans such as myself. Going for my capture session instantly brought me back to the days of the original Dream Team, and the resulting rush of nostalgia made me gain an appreciation for Beam's interpretation of this popular institution. It may be no NBA Jam, but it's a breath of fresh air in comparison to the previously discussed Atlas abomination, and it's definitely worth checking out if you're a fan of that golden age in basketball history. With that out of the way, let's raise this shindig to the next level by bringing on the real reason you all tuned into this video. I've successfully stood up for some notorious offenders over the years, and now the time has come to address the one that you've all been waiting for. My friends, please try to contain yourselves as we finally examine the legendary and larger than life Pictionary! All jokes aside, Pictionary, the 1990 collaboration between LJN and Software Creations, is one of the most unfairly obscure entries in the NES library. Completely unassuming on the surface layer, Pictionary kicks off with a bang in the form of the face-melting music from the maestro himself, Tim Follin. Longtime viewers of this series will recognize Tim and his brother Jeff as the composers of some of the all-time best chiptunes, and Pictionary continues the fallen streak of excellence. Tim's terrific compositions perfectly complement the artistic mini-games that constitute Pictionary's unique formula, and I had a blast solving puzzles while rocking out to that signature Fallen groove. Admittedly, the timer often kept me from formatting enough of the pieces to make a proper guess, but that doesn't stop Pictionary from being a fun little oddity, and I give it my seal of approval for the Fallen face melters alone. Going from one Fallen to another, here's the Super Nintendo version of Spider-Man and X-Men Arcade's Revenge. For those who missed my review of the handheld port, the premise involves the web-slinger rescuing the captured mutants and then teaming up with them to defeat the titular villain. The SNES and Game Boy iterations are essentially the same, with Gambit running for his life from a rolling ball, Wolverine slicing through a toy-filled death trap, and Cyclops blasting in a minecart. Storm, the sole exception to the rule, has to swim through an underwater maze, which sounds simple at first, but the exaggerated difficulty and lack of continues ensure that it quickly becomes a metal-testing task for even the most hardcore of retro enthusiasts, and I unfortunately wasn't up to the challenge during the brief time I was able to allot for my recording session. As much as I hate to say it, Arcade's Revenge has an amazing concept, but the execution fails to live up to its potential. It was cool to control Gambit and the rest of the characters when I was gifted this as a kid, but their mechanics and controls are less than ideal. Wolverine's healing factor is inconsistent, while Gambit's card attacks are limited in range and ineffective, and that's not even mentioning all the unbalanced damage system and hitbox issues. With all of that said though, I still hold a fondness for Arcade's Revenge, and I could never label it as terrible. To the best of my knowledge, this is the first major console-based comic book crossover, and it deserves to be recognized for that historical significance, so it's for that reason and the cheap cartridge prices that I'll give it a mild recommendation. This meeting of two comic industry icons may not be as marvelous as expected, but it can still provide some enjoyment when one's expectations are kept firmly in place, and anyone who's looking for a challenge will be more than satisfied with the aggravating assault of Arcade's Revenge. Beetlejuice for the Game Boy differs drastically from its rare-developed NES counterpart by being based on the animated series instead of the celluloid black comedy which inspired it. As such, the story is very light on substance and simply involves the Ghost with the Most dealing with an infestation that he accidentally unleashed on the Dietz's house. In spite of their differences in source material, the two 8-bit Beetlejuices have a long learning curve in common and leave the player with a feeling of being in over their head without a life preserver. Upon beginning my capture session, I was immediately greeted by an incapacitating bubble-shooting dryer, a trick staircase, and a seizure-inducing DDR-esque button sequence. At first, this all seemed like utter chaos, but it ended up being utter chaos that has some structure to it. As suggested in the intro cutscene, the pesky poltergeist's main assignment is to neutralize the ectoplasmic energy, and each of the rooms he enters entail a wide variety of activities to do so. The most common means of dealing with the supernatural scourge is by blasting them with projectiles, but there are a number of alternative solutions such as completing pipe puzzles, capturing small gremlins, and placing statues in their proper locations. While the variety of these segments is quite impressive, they each come with their own share of hurdles and their implementation is often unintuitive. Getting the gremlins in the chest is one of the most tedious things I've ever done with a controller in hand, and I found the DDR Seizure Fest to be a neat idea that was severely hindered by being confined to the D-pad. Factor on top of that the ridiculous difficulty, and you have a recipe for a flawed, frustrating animated adaptation that pales in comparison to its NES sibling. It's not a complete train wreck, and there are definitely some redeeming aspects in the mix, including the cute cartoony aesthetic and the excellent TheWiiGuy soundtrack, but I'm gonna have to refrain from lending it my recommendation. Continuing in the realm of licensed tie-ins that aren't quite as good as their fellow 8-bit counterpart, here's The Punisher! Appropriately subtitled The Ultimate Payback, this 1991 Game Boy release reunites the team of LJN and Beam to bring Marvel's resident badass anti-hero to Nintendo's old gray brick. As to be expected from the production crew and the property, The Ultimate Payback retains the rail shooter format of its NES older brother, only this time the perspective switches from third to first person, putting the player directly in Frank Castle's shoes as he enacts his signature brand of justice against the drug dealers and criminals that terrorize the innocent. Castle is of course equipped with his impressive arsenal of weaponry to dispatch the perps, and there's an additional array of power-up items accessible by breaking crates, windows, and other background scenery. As with the NES iteration, there are occasional civilian bystanders that have to be avoided, and failure to do so results in a massive health loss penalty. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but I might as well cut to the chase and answer the question that I'm sure is consuming your entire being at this very moment. Saxophone Sam sadly doesn't make an appearance in The Ultimate Payback, but his sister, Shopping Cart Sally, has inherited his ability of having the bad luck of being stuck in an active shootout, and she's joined via a literal fly-in cameo by the Webhead himself! Yes, the cartridge label isn't a lie. Spider-Man swings in to save the hostages during the first level boss fight and either praises or berates the violent vigilante depending on our performance. From here on out, the stakes raise to a whole new level as the brutality meter gets pushed to the max. I preface this review by stating that this is inferior to the NES iteration, and this is where it really starts to become apparent. Bullets start flying everywhere, and the shifted perspective means that we're unable to dodge the overwhelming enemy fire, so our limited supply of lives and power-ups are swiftly exhausted. Needless to say, my feelings on this comic crossover ended up being mixed. I really appreciated how well the license was applied and enjoyed the overall presentation, but I was annoyed by the sluggish nature of the D-pad and how it actively detracted from the fun factor. There are some rail shooters that work well enough with a controller, but this is certainly not one of them, and while the portable Punisher sinks nowhere near the depths of the 8-bit X-Men, it's still one of the weaker Marvel outings, and I'd suggest passing it over in favor of the infinitely better NES release. On a much lighter note, the time has finally come to cover the rest of the incredible Crash Dummies titles. In stark contrast to the gruesome Gunner, Incredible Crash Dummies for the NES and Game Boy are vastly different from their technologically superior sibling. While the former comes closest to aligning with the Super Nintendo side-scroller, the latter is a minigame collection that does a great job of capturing the tone of the classic PSAs. We get to assume the role of Slick and the rest of the gang as they perform their day job duties of driving down obstacle courses, defusing bombs, and causing as much damage as possible while descending from a rooftop. Minus the awkward Solar Jetman-esque spaceship stage, the controls are tight, the presentation is on point, and the Fallen soundtrack is straight fire. However, there are only a few events and they repeat in true arcade fashion, so the replay value is kind of limited, but for the short duration it lasts, the handheld Crash Dummies is a fun romp that's worth it for the novelty factor alone. The NES incarnation, on the other hand, doesn't hold up as well, which was quite surprising considering it's one of the final entries in the library of the beloved entertainment system. As mentioned previously, the NES Crash Dummies is similar in style to its software creation developed sibling, but it pushes the envelope of what the property has to offer with a few fresh ideas. On the positive side, there are now two protagonists to play as, with the first having a wheeled lower torso reminiscent of the bots from the Konami classic Cyber Stadium Base Wars. This was initially a welcome shakeup to the traditional platforming formula as it brought a Sonic-esque feel that was mostly lacking on the NES, but this unfortunately became more of a headache than a breath of fresh air. The controls for the wheeled warrior are very loose and slippery, and he bounces back with explosive results every time he takes a hit. As if that wasn't bad enough, this is exacerbated by the speed power-up, which raises the pace to an uncontrollable level that frequently led to decapitating accidents and disorienting reverse controls. Yes, you heard me right. When the Crash Dummies lose their heads, they also lose all sense of direction, and this turned what should have been a light and lively capture session into a PTSD-inducing hellscape. Fortunately, for the sake of my sanity, the second character fits snugly into the conventional archetypes and made my recordings a bit more manageable, but the problems that plagued his predecessors sadly persisted. Nevertheless, in spite of these stressful hurdles, I was able to progress through most of the adventure, and I can safely say that this is far from the worst LJN game. For all its flaws, this still has that quirky Crash Dummies humor and fallen music, and those alone set it head and shoulders above the likes of Bill and Ted. But unless you're a completist NES collector or a rabid fan of the PSAs, then you'll probably want to stick with the SNES card instead. And now we've come to the conclusion of this colossal celebration. We're finally at the last remaining loose end, and I can think of no better way to close out this video than with one of the games that had the biggest impact in the creation of this series. No, I'm not talking about Wolverine. That is going to be the topic of the eventual finale, but for now, we're going to take a trip down nostalgia lane with Terminator 2. Developed by Beam, Software Creations, and my mortal nemesis Bits, T2 for the Game Boy and NES offer a diverse range of takes on the beloved property that do a decent job of capturing the post-apocalyptic vibe of the James Cameron movie masterpiece. Viewers who have been following this series for a while will be aware that I already reviewed the Super Nintendo port of the arcade cabinet and the less than stellar SNES side-scroller, so it should come as no surprise that the Game Boy titles followed this exact same formula. As to be expected from the fate of their similar work on The Punisher, Beam did the best that they could in translating the arcade rail shooter to the handheld market, but the awkward D-pad targeting, exaggerated difficulty, and limited lives again ensured that it's almost impossible to finish. Try as I might, I kept getting slaughtered by the Skynet soldiers, and being that there aren't any cheat codes to alleviate the onslaught, the level 4 boss became a permanent roadblock. On the other end of the Game Boy spectrum, Bits opted for an original approach that plays very loose with the lore by letting the player assume the role of a long-haired character that resembles Sarah Connor in the midst of the post-Judgment Day war with the machines. As a fan of the film since childhood, this made no sense to me whatsoever. Sarah's supposed to be dead in this timeline, but there she is delivering the backstory in the transitional cutscenes, and the whole thing messed me up. Anachronism issues aside, the gameplay itself gets off on the wrong foot as there are a series of towers scattered across the ravaged landscape and a laser barrier preventing progress placed at the exit. The programmers themselves provide minimal means of instruction for how to solve this conundrum beyond a hint obtained from an easily missed flashing icon, and while I initially shrugged this off as a momentary aberration, it sadly turned out to be an omen for the problems plaguing Bits' project. For starters, we're only allotted a single life to defeat the robot army, which is insane in and of itself, but then we're required to rewire the circuits of a T-800s as a rapidly ticking timer counts down in the corner of the screen. Whereas the Beetlejuice pipe puzzle allowed the player to pause and devise the correct strategy, Bits showed no such mercy, and failure to connect the wires before the clock strikes 0 results in an instant game over. To quote myself from the Spider-Man 2 episode, Bits screwed up, just as they have countless times in the past. I shouldn't have been surprised about that, but I still gave them a fair chance and they inevitably let me down. Suffice it to say, Bits' blunder left a bad taste in my mouth, but luckily for me, there was a light at the end of this tumultuous tunnel that quickly brushed it away. Ah, sweet relief. Software Creations' 1992 interpretation of the Schwarzenegger blockbuster was a frequent rental when I was a kid, and there are multiple reasons for that. For starters, it differentiates itself from its peers by remaining truer to the narrative of the source material. We're immediately placed in the boots of the good T-800 as we traverse through a rough and rowdy truck stop in order to rescue the young John Connor. While the action can be overwhelming and the suspension of disbelief is often stretched to its limits, the overall experience of pounding foes to pulp in conjunction with the adrenaline-charged Fallen tunes is exhilarating to say the very least. I would of course be dishonest if I didn't admit that NES T2 suffers from its share of stumbling blocks, the biggest of which being the irritating tunnel chase and the blood-boiling conclusion, but in all of my years playing this game, none of that has ever ruined my personal enjoyment. NES T2 may not be a great game, and I can understand why it's generally not held in the highest esteem among the retro community, but I think it still holds up and it'll always hold a very special place in my heart. Without this and Wolverine, I would have never created this show, IUPG likely wouldn't exist, and most of you watching this right now would never have found my channel. So it's for that reason that I give this dusty piece of plastic my sincerest thanks, and I'm going to extend that thanks outwards towards the viewers and all of my new patrons on Patreon. Whether you've been watching for years now or you just subbed recently, your support means the world to me, and I look forward to making the best videos I can for you all well into the future. Anyway, now that I've wrapped up all of the loose ends and celebrated this monumental milestone in grand style, it's time to close out the year with an epic IUPG Worst Games extravaganza. Be sure to come back for that, but until then, this is Matt, aka the LJN Defender, signing out. Thanks for watching. If you like what you saw and you want to see more, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and check out the other videos on the screen right now. And if you're interested in taking your support of the channel to the next level, consider becoming one of my patrons on Patreon or picking up a shirt from TeePublic or Redbubble. Thanks again.